Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. I'm Christina Nosti, the Events and Marketing Director at Miami's independently owned bookstore, Books and Books, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Mohsin Hamid to celebrate the publication of his new novel, The Last White Man, a provocative tale that raises questions of racial and social justice and is published by our friends at Riverhead Books. This event would not be possible without the generous participation of our host, Miami Book Fair, and the partnership of our many independent bookstore colleagues throughout the U.S. I don't have time to mention each and every one of them by name, but I'll be posting their names and website information in the chat. So please check them out and purchase your copy of The Last White Man from your favorite if you haven't already, and be sure to give them some love in the chat. Mohsin Hamid is the author of 5 novels, including the Booker Prize finalists and New York Times-bestsellers Exit West and The Reluctant Fundamentalist. His essays, some collected as Discontent and Its Civilizations, have appeared in the New York Times, The Washington Post, and elsewhere. In conversation with Mohsin tonight, we're joined by Danzy Senna, whose first novel, the best-selling Caucasia, won the Stephen Crane Award for Best New Fiction and the American Library Association's Alex Award, was a finalist for the International Dublin Literary Award, and has been translated into nearly a dozen languages. A recipient of the Whiting Writers Award, Senna is also the author of the memoir, Where Did You Sleep Last Night?, the story collection, You Are Free, and the novels, Symptomatic and New People. Remember to post your questions for the author in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and we thank you for supporting independent bookstores. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage.
Hi there, Mohsin. It's great to be here with you.
Likewise.
And I'm so excited to talk about your new book. And I would love for you to just read for a minute or two, partly because I just think the tone and the language are so interesting and distinctive and striking and beautiful. And I would love for us to start just hearing you read it.
Sure, and thank you, Christina, for having me, and also to Danzy for doing this. It's an honor to be in conversation together. So, thank you both. Here's how the book begins. One morning, Anders, a white man, woke up to find he had turned a deep and undeniable brown. This dawned upon him gradually, and then suddenly. First as a sense, as he reached for his phone, that the early light was doing something strange to the color of his forearm. Subsequently, and with a start, as a momentary conviction that there was somebody else in bed with him, male, darker. But this, terrifying though it was surely impossible. And he was reassured that the other moved as he moved, was in fact not a person, not a separate person, but was just him, Anders, causing a wave of relief. For if the idea that someone else was there was only imagined, then of course the notion that he had changed color was a trick too, an optical illusion or a mental artifact, born in the slippery halfway place between dreams and wakefulness, except that by now he had his phone in his hands and he had reversed the camera, and he saw that the face looking back at him was not his at all.
Thank you. That's such an amazing opening. And I found this book so interesting in terms of all of the choices you made. And I think of writing a novel as just a series of these choices we make to do one thing and not another. But what was really, I wanted to start by asking you about the origins of this idea for this novel, because I've seen that you talk about 9/11 and that the book has been gestating for many decades and sort of being thought about and processed and even written for a very long time. And I was thinking about between 9/11 and today, the world that has changed so dramatically in that time period for all of us, and especially maybe around questions of power and race and identity. And so I was just interested, and this is kind of a novelist question, but also a question about history and the world and being a writer at this time. Like, how did you sort of continue to be invested in the idea that began around 9/11, and sort of how did that book grow with you and change over the decades that you thought about it?
Yeah, well, as you know yourself, when we talk about where a book comes from, we're partly just making it up, right? We don't really know where our books come from. But that said, you have a kind of feeling that this is sort of where things started. And for me, it was in 2001, I was 30 years old, and I had had about 18 of those years in the US and 12 in Pakistan. And I grew up in these liberal enclaves, and I was living in these liberal cities, the Bay Area in California, Cambridge, Massachusetts, New York City. And I'd gone to these sort of elite universities and had a well-paying job. And while I was obviously a brown man with a Muslim name, I wouldn't say that discrimination featured so prominently in what I would consider to have been, the concerns of my life. I was aware of it; it was sort of there, but for the most part, it wasn't something that I spent too much time thinking about. And as I say this, I've actually had conversations about this book in the last week, and something has struck me, which is that one of my father's friends came to talk in San Francisco, and he said, when you said that discrimination didn't feel so prominent in your life, he said it was so different from me, because in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it was so powerfully prominent in his life. Mm-hmm. And another friend of mine brought his son to a talk in Houston, and this young man was born in 2003, and he's a Pakistani American. He says, when you said that, I can't believe it, because in my whole life, it has been such a prominent feature. It's surprising to me you could say this. But, in the 1990s, there was a moment, and particularly lived in certain parts of America, where it was possible to imagine that things were headed in a sort of different direction, that the discrimination was waning, that if you were outside the sort of white-black binary in the United States, you for the most part could get away with things if you were had enough money, and you had a certain kind of class background that education gives you, that you've gone to certain schools. And then all of a sudden 9/11 happens, and that changes for me. And suddenly, at the airport, they're pulling you aside, or you're on an aircraft on the tarmac, and they stop the aircraft and they come on board the aircraft and take you off the aircraft. And when you return to the plane after having been searched again, your fellow passengers are less than thrilled to see you back, accompanied by 2 security guards. Or you come to the immigration at JFK Airport, and they take you to a separate room, and you wait for 3 or 4 hours, and they grill you for an hour, and then to another room where you have to register and say where your address is going to be, and all this sort of strange stuff. And it wasn't just officialdom. You would get onto a bus, a little bit unshaven with a backpack, and somebody would get up and change their seat. And with these things, you're never quite sure what's going on. Like, is this coincidence? Am I really imagining this? But it was a distinct feeling that that I had lost something. And I had this feeling that I wanted it to go back to how it was before 9/11. And I thought it would. I thought this will pass. People will get over it. But time went by, and it didn't go back very quickly, or at all, maybe, to what it had been before. And I started to think, what is this feeling of loss? What have I lost? And I thought that, maybe what I've lost is a kind of partial whiteness, in the sense that I wasn't white. But if whiteness means, just being a human being, presenting yourself without the additional attachment of suspicion or sense of threat, or connotation, if it just means being you, that I felt I had lost. And then I thought, why do I want this back, and what does it mean to want it back, and what was I doing when I had this thing that I've lost?
Mm.
Was I, complicit in something? Should I, instead of, wishing that things were before they were, before 9/11, should I instead be saying, what was I doing before 9/11 to be so blind and so, in a sense, participatory in something that clearly can be turned and off in an instant? Anyway, so these thoughts stayed for a while, and I wrote a novel called The Reluctant Fundamentalist, which was more directly dealing with the suspicions between, Muslim background people and people, from America, from the West, who were from different backgrounds and were suspicious of people with Muslim backgrounds, and that mutual suspicion. But the idea of something about one's identity and how you can imagine yourself to have a particular kind of identity, and then have another identity just imagined upon you because you haven't changed. You're the same person. This treatment is happening because other people are now imagining you differently. That just stuck with me. And at some point I had the idea of this character who goes to bed one day thinking that he is white, and wakes up the next day with dark skin, and a world where this begins to happen. And also, I guess around this time, a whole bunch of other things had been going on, in the United States and elsewhere, where sort of white nationalism had never gone away, but had suddenly appeared very prominently, and other types of similar, nationalistic movements in different cultures, Hindutva in India, and sort of kind of Muslim version in Pakistan, and Turkey, Russia. And so I thought something is going on. All over the world, there's something about people in this dominant group suddenly feeling like they're losing their membership in that group, and then reasserting themselves. And so I thought the time had come to write it. And that's really, I guess, in a very long way, how I got to the book.
That is so interesting. And I sort of was thinking about so many issues in my family and my own identity growing up mixed race in the United States, and sort of passing as white unwittingly. And when you were just talking right now, I was thinking how my father, who grew up in the Jim Crow South, a Black man in the Jim Crow South, used to say that there was a joke growing up, like if a Black man wants to sit at the front of the bus, he just puts on a turban. And that's in the 50s. And like that, if you want to be read as neutral, you become a foreigner and not a Black American. And so it's just, I love what you're talking about so much, is the fluidity of race and the constructedness of race, and how it can change depending on these contexts, and how you can go to bed one person and move into a different context and become another, and what that does to one's identity is so fascinating. And I think it's interesting you chose to, what the story you're telling is one you've explored sort of in some ways in some of your other work, but you chose to make it a place that isn't specified. And the name Anders, and Una is the white woman who he's involved with. And I'm just interested in that choice to kind of keep it outside of a specific geographical and temporal space.
Yeah, well, I think I've gotten quite attached to the idea that one thing that written fiction can do particularly well is give space, to readers to imagine for themselves. They imagine the book into existence. So when you watch a television show or you see a film, it looks like the world, right? But when you read a book, it looks like this.
Yeah.
And that is nothing like the world. It's just these words and these sentences and these punctuation marks and blank page paper. And you, the reader, create images and emotions and a sense of what the world is. And I thought, because the reader makes so much of a book, because the reader is, I think, in a sense, more creative than in almost any other mass storytelling form. The reader really is doing half the work of a novel.
Yeah.
I thought, I want to give space to the reader. So I'm not going to name most of these characters. I won't name the place. I'm going to keep the story quite brief. I will not describe the dialogue. Things will be said, but the exact way in which people speak won't be rendered in great detail. so that you have the freedom to imagine some of these interactions and some of this place for yourself. And it's interesting because in the US already I've encountered, one person saying, why did you choose not to set this in the US? And I told that interviewer, I said, it's funny you say that because the previous interviewer said, it's obviously set in the US. Why did you choose not to make it clear that it was in the US? And, and somebody else said it was set in South Africa. And I thought, it's interesting because it's up to you in a way where it's set. And that's useful both because, of course, there are readers outside the United States, and because there are readers all over the world. And also because even for readers in the United States, your instinct about whether this feels like America or feels like some other place tells you something. And
yeah,
so yeah,
like the Rorschach test, where we get to understand
absolutely
our own projections onto it in a way.
Exactly. I mean, I think that inviting a reader to play make-believe, which is what a novel does, and then giving the reader enough space where what they do might surprise them is, for me, a very fertile thing. Because, as adults, we so rarely are invited to play in our imaginations. We obviously imagine stuff, and we do it by ourselves. But, after we grow up, we stop often doing things like, you're a kid and you pretend, okay, well, we're both pirates, or we're both fairies, or we're both astronauts, and let's just do that. And you can pretend. And then after you're 8 or 9 or 10 or whatever it is, you stop doing that so much. And the time when you do that after that is often, when you're reading a novel and the writer says, let's go into this imaginary place. And so yes, it's to give the reader freedom to kind of do what they need to do imaginatively with this. And to have
I like it too around questions of race and power and identity, because it is so important that the reader interrogate their own presumptions. And so kind of practicing that restraint creates a really interesting experience, a little bit of anxiety for the reader, actually, which I like.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that that I've felt as somebody who's sort of from outside the typical American racial binary, to the extent that in America there's the idea of whiteness, there's an idea of blackness, and blackness as an idea was created, so that there could be whiteness. So you could say whiteness was created so there could be blackness, but property rights were being asserted. And some people needed to in that system needed to believe that there were people who were property, and so therefore you create this thing. In Europe you were French or German or whatever, but now in America you have this concept of whiteness. Now the thing itself is a very unstable, imagined construct. I mean, it's not that it's not real in the sense that it operates in a real way. Once you believe in it, it becomes real when you enact it upon somebody else. But you've kind of imagined the thing into existence. It's not like a waterfall, right? Or like a planet that is just there. And so I think for the reader, as you say, when you're not given, I guess, enough information to have it fully imagined into existence for you, when you're sort of generating a sense of race in the novel from within yourself, that is an anxious position. Like, for example, what does Anders look like when he changes? What exactly, we don't really know. We know he looks different, and Una thinks he's a different kind of person, but what do you imagine that to be? And so I think, I think that being forced to generate your own imagination of the racial universe of the novel is a very uncomfortable thing, but it's also a very fertile thing, because when you do it, you realize what you're doing.
Yeah, I like that idea, and how it sort of, the experience of reading that from that sort of uncertain position, I feel like replicates some of my own experience in the world of being like ambiguous and the object of those projections. And I also really like what you're saying about the sort of unique experience of the novel versus these other forms of storytelling, and in particular television and film, in part because I live in LA, and I feel like I'm like this archaic storyteller, and that, is there really a space for the novel to do something different and to kind of compete with these other forms of storytelling in the experience of the person who wants to hear a story. And I read a quote of you talking about that, but it was really so reassuring in a way for me as a novelist.
Well, I think it's something that we as novelists can really lean into, because, when a reader gets to be the casting director and the cinematographer and the director of the novel, right? And, that involves a certain degree of work. So in a sense, the novel always will be a more frictional art form than cinema and television, where, by its nature, you don't slip into it as easily, maybe.
Yeah.
That said, so the friction means, oh, well, it's not as, easily spread or easily entered into. And so you can despair and say, well, my storytelling form, it's harder for people to get into it. But on the other hand, I think that it's a different thing. You aren't a viewer of a novel as a reader. You are a co-creator of that novel. And so what the novel lacks in terms of ease of entry, it gains in terms of allowing readers to make stuff. And that for me is a really interesting place for us to play in.
Yeah, it's very exciting. And I do feel that I more sort of whole body experience when I read as opposed to watching something. So I was glad to have you kind of articulate that. One of the things that's really exciting and sort of fun in a strange way in this novel is you start with this premise of this white man waking up and discovering he's turned dark. And then, it's sort of like a pandemic, like it begins to spread. Other people have this experience. And I was like, this is the nice pandemic. Like, I wish we were in this pandemic and not the one we're really in. But there was, I also just liked seeing the sort of situations that you then place him and these other characters in, and sort of the sense that, like, the father of Anders and the mother of Una are really grasping and holding on to the idea of whiteness, and they're very nostalgic and protective of this idea and horrified to see white people turning dark. And then, the sense of like feeling threatened by your own body is really interesting. And sort of then the reaction of the culture at large felt like very resonant with today. Like, these things are changing, they're inevitable. There's this idea of the global majority as quote unquote people of color, and there's an anxiety around that, and the sort of the idea of being replaced or becoming obsolete. My mother, actually, who's very excited about this, she's the last white person in our family, and like all her children identify as Black, married people of color, and are, all her grandchildren are non-white, and she's, sort of like, great, thank God, this is. But anyway, I was just interested in like this idea of something inevitable happening, and then the sort of reactionary elements that are created by that. And, that's clearly speaking to the world we live in today.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that in a sense it's a novel written in the pandemic. That the pandemic did some strange things, but this feeling that reality suddenly got completely turned inside out, and you could just stay home for months, and schools would be shut, and there was no international flights, and you couldn't believe those things would happen, and then suddenly they've happened. Also, right. Now it's hard to remember, but in the initial few weeks, it was unclear just how bad this thing was going to get. Was there going to be some real end of things? And obviously millions of people died. It got very bad, but there was a possibility that it would be a kind of species, if not eradicating, but like on the scale of some of the great illnesses of the past. And in this novel too, in a sense, it's unclear how bad it's going to get. Bad in quotes, but for some of the characters, how bad it's going to get. Also, it begins with sort of one person getting this thing or having this thing, and then a few more, and it seems in the distance, and it comes closer, and it. So it is, I guess, it was of that time, but also related to that was my sense that there's something quite peculiar happening in the world today. often we imagine that in the US, this sort of rise of white nationalism is a uniquely American thing. And in some ways, in its expressions, it's peculiarly American. But the rise of these populist leaders who are telling kind of dominant groups or historically dominant groups in their countries that we are the real citizens and we need to protect ourselves against erosion. And we need to have a sort of nostalgic politics that goes back to our better previous days, the classical age of Islam, or of Hindutva in India, or Britain before migrants in the case of Brexit, or Russia before the end of the Soviet Union in sort of Putin's imaginings. This stuff is way too common and way too widespread to be unique to one country. Something is going on. If most of the countries in the world either have a charismatic leader saying these things in power, or somebody who's not in power challenging towards power, but hasn't yet quite taken it. And I think this feeling of kind of group erosion is being coupled with this crazy instinct to sort ourselves, that we feel that we have to decide who is in our group and who isn't. And partly that's because of technology. Now that we have social media and we're constantly on our phones and our screens, our phones and screens are saying, do you like this or not like this? Do you follow this person or do you unfollow this person? And we're having this heightened, are you like me or not like me response to almost everything. But partly it's also because, human history goes through these cycles where there's a cycle where dominant narratives tend to be about how we can do things together and build some sort of future together. And then we build, the Roman Empire, or we build, Muslim Andalusia in Spain, or we build, the Ottoman Empire, or Soviet Union, or whatever it was. And in those entities, they may have existed by force, but they had a narrative that allowed very different people to imagine that they were part of this thing. And then they start to come apart. And when they start to come apart, a new narrative starts to come out. And that new narrative is other people are a threat to you. People who are not like you are a threat. There's no way actually that we can kind of coexist. It's a battle of all against all. And what's happened is in a way, it's almost purely a narrative change. We've shifted stories from, a glorious future of us all in a socialist paradise to Russians must resist this Ukrainian, usurping of our natural space. Or similarly in the United States or in India or Pakistan or anywhere else, something like that's going on. And so, yes, I think that, for me, it's the combination of this pandemic moment and this global feeling of reasserting a sense of threat to oneself, to one's group, that have coincided and that sort of set up the dynamics for the book.
Yeah, I think, you can look to the past to see these moments happening in other times and places, but it's interesting to hear you see it happening in all of these different nations and disparate, countries, and it's sort of happening simultaneously. It's really interesting.
My friends in India can't speak to their own relatives about Modi. My friends in Pakistan can't speak to their own friends about Imran Khan. People in America can't speak to their own cousins about Trump. Like, in Britain, people don't speak to their own spouses about Brexit. This is strange, and it's very widespread, and it suggests some, I think, fundamental shift in human narrative, which I think is not a good shift, and one that we would be foolish to allow go unchallenged. And so I think the idea of trying to use stories to lean against this kind of storytelling, the people not are a threat kind of storytelling, becomes very important.
I have one more question of my own, then I'm going to ask you some of the questions from the audience. But I was interested in, the last white man refers to, at least there's a lot of people that are maybe feeling they're the last white man, but the parents of the two sort of main characters are the ones I mentioned who were kind of clinging to this idea of whiteness and the past. And in order to write fiction, do you have to kind of feel some kind of, maybe not love, but real compassion for those characters, as well as, you know, the characters who undergo change and evolve or are already evolved.
Yeah, I mean, for me, absolutely yes. And I think in a sense that that's the dangerous terrain. You know,
Yeah.
to give a character the dignity of their own interiority, to allow them to be the hero of their narrative, even if that narrative or that animating impulse is something that as a writer or as a person you might find, you know, profoundly objectionable. To me, is part of the task. In other words, in this novel, for example, the novel is a novel about loss, about people losing things. And it's, of course, losing of one's racial identity, but also in Anders' father's case, he's at the end of his life, you know, losing his life. Una's mother has lost, you know, her son, Una's brother, and her husband, Una's father, and feels that her group is losing, she's losing in a sense, you know, her group, sort of this idea of whiteness. And the novel takes, I guess, very seriously the idea of this loss. Because I think at the moment in human society, there is this profound sense of loss. Things are changing so rapidly. And because of technology, the pace of change is accelerating, that many of us feel just overwhelmed, you know, unmoored. We're losing things so fast. Like already my children are experiencing a childhood that seems so different from mine.
Yeah.
And you know, as that stuff gets lost, it creates a profound anxiety. And I think, you know, that anxiety, if we don't acknowledge it, that is the sort of fertile ground where these nostalgic appeals and the idea of the group is threatened takes root. And so I think for me, it's much more important to acknowledge the anxiety, you know, to give the anxiety and the sense of loss dignity. Not to say, not that the thing being lost needs to be dignified, but the person who feels that they're losing needs a sense of dignity around the sense of loss, if we're to understand them and if we're to try to, you know, to move things. In the same way that if you have a friend whose mother or father is a real jerk, and that person passes away, you know, it's one thing to tell your friend that I'm so sorry that you lost a parent, and to hold them and to make them, you know, feel compassion, without saying that the parent was a nice person. And so I think for these characters, what I've tried to do, you know, which is potentially, I suppose, a fraught or even dangerous thing to do, is to allow them to really be the heroes of their own narrative, to acknowledge the feeling of loss that they're having, and to see if we can't win through to something with that. And you know, and winning through for me in this novel it really is based on love. That, you know, it's Anders' father's love for his son, despite being completely unsettled by what's happened to his son, that makes him want to bequeath something to his son, to show his son that, you know, he can die, he can face death, you know, with dignity. And, you know, it's Una's love for her mother that sort of has her stay with her mother, despite her mother's, you know, increasingly crazy views. And Una's daughter's love for her grandmother, who, you know, at the end of the novel, in a sense, her daughter's horrified by what her grandmother thinks. And she tells her grandmother, look, you know, stop saying this stuff. But she says it without removing love from her grandmother, and offering her grandmother maybe a bridge that she could walk across if she wanted to walk across, away from where she had been before. And so for me, that's very important. I think that that the enterprise does depend on allowing these human beings to be the heroes of what they imagine their stories to be, and then to see, can a path be built from that story to a better place.
So interesting, and sort of in some ways antithetical to the tone of the conversation in the world, which I think is, you know, great when novels can offer a different tonality and a different way of thinking about it. So I'm just going to look at some of the questions.
I want to say one thing in response to what you just said in terms of the antithetical to the tone. You know, living in Pakistan with Afghanistan, you know, just a few hours drive from my house, and seeing the kind of civil war that has, you know, happened there. I'm certain that in Kabul, there were many more progressive, open-minded people than there were sort of Taliban fighters who came to the city. But there was a civil war, and those people lost. And I think that it's worth asking ourselves, to what extent is a descent into that kind of conflict possible in our societies? I think it's too easy to imagine, look, that could never happen. We'll never get that far.
Right.
And so for me, the tone of unyielding opposition is a tone that suggests that we will eventually come to a contest of power. And it is entirely possible that in the contest of power, those who have sort of moral, the moral righteousness or what I would believe to moral correctness could win. It's also possible they could lose. And it certainly isn't a kind of contest anybody should want. Like, nobody should want their society to become like Afghanistan. And so I think I'm a little bit concerned, by the tone. Not by being horrified by what's going on. I mean, I'm horrified by what's going on. But I think that that tonally, and I think that tone is also appropriate. But I think that more than one tone needs to be explored. Is there a way, as groups are sort of digging in and becoming more intensified in their conflict, is there a way to destabilize that development, and free up people to shift groups, to no longer be a participant in this battle of all against all? And so yeah, I think it is against, I guess, a lot of the tone that we see at the moment. But I also think that the danger that we face is profound, and not just one tone is going to be enough to see us through.
Yeah, and you're speaking from sort of seeing it firsthand and how it can go, and people, I think, especially in the United States, maybe not believing that, even though we can look to history here and see that we don't somehow have that. We have a little bit of that amnesia that is, so strong in this country, and I do think that fiction, one of the things that made me want to be a fiction writer, is that radical experience of having to experience the world from someone who is not you, from their point of view, and that in and of itself is what fiction is doing. So it was interesting. And the worst fiction doesn't do the work you're talking about. I think we've all read that, and it feels like medicine or didactic.
In a way, one has to run the risk of being perceived as a traitor by some people of one's own group if one is going to try to destabilize that dynamic that causes another group to be in conflict of one's own, right? So if you try to broker Indo-Pak peace, and I've been involved in artists, who cross the border, some people hate that idea. How can you? And there's this sort of reek of I guess, treachery around that. And so similarly in a fictional construct, if you create these characters who have profoundly objectionable views, and you do so in a sense with a kind of care for them, there is a question of, it has some kind of treachery been perpetrated here, and I think it's not one that one can ignore, but I think it's one that for me is counterproductive. I think as artists and as writers, it's important to try to destabilize some of these binaries and try to get people out of the conflict that they think they must pursue, and in particular in this novel, in a sense, by focusing on the more powerful and dominant party, which is focusing on these sort of characters who believe themselves to be white, and seeing if it's possible to destabilize what they believe. Yes.
There's a writer I really love called Noel Ignatieff. Have you read How the Irish Became White?
No.
It's amazing.
I love the title.
Yeah, and he's white. He writes about being a traitor to his own race, and talks about whiteness as a construct, and it's just a sort of language we use for social power. And anyway, you would love him. He's
I will
great.
check him out. Thank you.
So one of the questions in the Q&A is asking about the influence of Kafka in the Metamorphosis on this book, and I'm probably from the reading the opening.
Yeah, so in Kafka's classic Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa wakes up one day and he's a giant bug, and we go from there. And obviously, the opening of this book, nods to that move. I mean, it's probably worth mentioning, of course, that Kafka wasn't the first person to take a character, and transform them into something else. Whether that's Greek mythology or Hindu mythology or the Arabian Nights, or every tradition, of course, has some version, but definitely Kafka's move and the move of this novel are I suppose, in a conversation. I've always been very interested in early and mid 20th century sort of modernist writers, the Virginia Woolfs and Kafkas and Calvinos and Jorge Luis Borges, and these kind of writers who were playing with form and playing with reality at a time like ours, when wars were on the increase and people were being placed into out groups and exterminated, in fact, and technology was changing. And I think that we can learn a lot from that period, but also from those writers. What I think Kafka was trying to do, in a sense, was to say, here's how Gregor Samsa, in a sense, ceases to belong to humanity. That in the same way that in the, I guess, industrial age, you do a job that doesn't feel like a real job, you're just doing some repetitive task over and over again. But also in the same way that in the Europe of that time, certain groups of people, most notably Jews, were suddenly no longer human. And I think that Kafka was exploring both those European specific cultural themes and also a general industrial revolution theme. I guess what I'm trying to do in this book is something slightly different, which is imagine a world where everybody's a bug and they suddenly become human. Or if we were all humans, we all become bugs together. In a sense, if Kafka's preoccupation was the way in which one of us can be cut off from the herd, mine is how we come up with the idea of the herd, and whether, in a sense, the herd can be imagined away, and we're left with just animals, roaming on the savannah. So I guess you could say they're, in a way, mirror image projects. They're doing similar things, but perhaps in opposite directions.
Yes, I love that. This question is, I was mesmerized by your writing, most long paragraphs for one sentence with partial and repetitive phrases. I felt like I was on a boat rocking back and forth while making some progress forward. What led to your style for this book? From Richard Ellenson.
So that's a very interesting question. And, the sentences of the novel are, I guess they do two things. One is that they often change perspective within a sentence. So you're in Anders's head, and then he's going to see his father. And in the same sentence, you're sort of in Anders's father's head. And then you're kind of in this omniscient, authorial point of view, looking at the characters from outside, this sort of third person. And I think that idea of a point of view being fluid within a sentence is resonating with the idea of the character's point of views becoming fluid in the course of the novel, and also maybe the reader's point of view becoming a little bit fluid, hopefully, during the course of reading the novel. But also the way the sentences are built is that often an idea will be put forth, and then it's kind of, well, but also this, and then maybe a little bit of that happened, and actually there's more of this, and I think that when we think as human beings, we're often thinking like that. I'll say something, and I'll say that's not quite right, and then I'll say something, and you keep meandering towards an understanding of something. Now, these days we are almost prone to using a kind of social media approach of putting out a tweet and then saying, this is what I think, and I'm ready to die by that. And I think that it becomes, in a sense, performative language, where we say something and then we are wedded to the thing that we have said, and we will perform an allegiance to what we've said, as opposed to, I guess, the kind of investigative language, we're saying something and we're not quite sure if we think the same thing the next day. And then we kind of, and I think it's, in a sense, much more fertile to have language meander towards ever greater understanding than to have language sort of attest an unchanging truth. I mean, there are some unchanging truths, but most of the time, what we're doing is we're saying something that we're not quite sure about. So So I guess that's how the sentences are built. And the last thing I'll say about that is, about 30 years ago, I had the enormous kind of cosmic good fortune of taking a writing class with Toni Morrison. And I began my first novel in this class. And she said something that stayed with me, which is that your reader, you should keep your reader a half heartbeat ahead of the action of the novel. They shouldn't know what's coming next, but when it comes, it should feel inevitable. And I think, for a filmmaker, that is done through the score, it's done through the camera movement, etc. But, for those of us who are novelists, in many ways, it's the way that you build the sentences that begins to set the stage for certain kinds of movement in perspective and in point of view and in just attitude, that then when they happen, the work has already been done. And so the book is written in this, I guess, this way, hopefully trying to set the stage emotionally for what's going to happen in the book. Whether it succeeds is sort of up to the reader, but that was the intention.
Well, definitely. Do you do social media at all?
No, I don't. So
I don't either. So we're out of the. But I mean, reading the book and reading fiction in general always feels like the opposite of what my experience is of reading Twitter.
Yeah.
Like I get a very jangled feeling, and then like the novel feels like both the balm for that, but also for like my attention span to not be broken.
I think that's right. I think that for me, I find Twitter to be and social media to be very uncomfortable. I mean, maybe somewhat addictive, but it's also uncomfortable. Like it brings out a kind of combative, but also narcissistic and kind of insecure. Like I'm this this sort of I guess aggressive, show-offy, tragically frightened. Like it's this weird thing it does to me. I think it does it a lot, and I don't like it, so I just stay off the thing. A lot of people are on it and hate it, but they sort of still persist. Whereas for me, a novel is, as you say, entirely the opposite, right? Like you're not, as a reader, ever performing because nobody gets to see how you read, and so you just sort of relax into your experience of it. And I think to not be performative is such a liberation for all of us.
Oh my God, that's so great. I love that. That's like really makes me happy to hear you say that. And someone asked, do you write your first draft in longhand or do you write it on the computer?
I write on the computer, and but I have I guess a strange relationship to writing longhand. When I was in about 3rd or 4th grade, my parents were called into school because they found that their son couldn't really write. And they would show this page of supposed writing, and it was nobody could read what was written there, and they thought this is like complete gibberish. Like, what has this guy done? And so they sent me off, and I was in California at the time, and they sent me off to sort of special education class, I guess. And there, this teacher, asked me to just print in all caps. And they said, "Oh, okay, your penmanship is very poor, and your handwriting, your spelling is atrocious. You mix up your letters quite a bit, but what you're saying is fine. You can write. Go back to class and tell them not to worry about your spelling. You don't have to write in cursive. You can just block print. And if it's messy, it's totally okay. Just go back and do that." And I sort of block printed my way through elementary school, high school, college, even law school. We still in law school, I mean, we had computers by college and law school, but still exams were done in these blue books, and you'd have to sort of, so I basically wrote, I guess, half or a third as fast as everybody else. I was a very, very slow writer. And I had to really focus and write very neatly and slowly. And I think it really shaped in a way how I write. I write very small novels very slowly. And because I suppose I never evolved into somebody who could write very quickly, I developed into somebody who thought very carefully about what they wrote because they couldn't write much. And so, if you ask, do you write your first drafts in longhand? The answer is no, but it's also that because I can't really write them in longhand, they look the way they do. You know, these sort of small books that, you know, where I guess I've sort of painstakingly gone into my way of doing it is my way of reacting to that, you know. And it's a funny thing. And sometimes I tell, you know, people, I tell this story, and somebody will, you know, tell me that they're in the audience, that their kid, you know, really struggles with writing. And I always say, look, you know, it may just turn out that this thing that you'll think of as a struggle is kind of like your superpower. You know, the fact that you write much slower than everybody else means that you're going to have to figure out a different way to write. And if you do figure out a different way to write, well, it turns out that that can be, you know, quite useful to write differently. So yeah, I guess that's my story with longhand and writing.
Do you think you do less drafts because of that? Like, does the first draft feel more like you've written already all the drafts in there?
It's changed. So I've gone from being, you know, first two novels were like one draft a year for 7 years, and you know, I would, you know, toss out each failed draft one after the other. And then in the last, I guess, decade and a half, it's been more like, you know, a few partial attempts, you know, little sketches that didn't work, but then quickly, within a couple of years, getting to a point where I sort of knew how it was going to work, and then a draft that looked a lot like the finished book. And I suppose, you know, a lot of writing is teaching yourself how to write your books. And so the first couple of books, the first 15 years of novel writing for me, were having no idea how to write a novel, really, and then having to write novel after novel, draft after draft, figure it out. But more recently, I guess I know a little bit more, and so I have to do things to figure out, you know, if this tone, if this movement, if this way is going to, you know, if there's going to be music in it or not. But within, you know, playing just a chapter or two of the music, it becomes clear that it is there or isn't there, and I can, you know, imagine the rest of the composition. So it's changed for me. You know, I think it really has gone from, I was very much a drafting novelist for about 15 years, and now I'm kind of a, you know, messing around a bit, and then one good draft which gets polished, kind of a novelist. So I've changed.
It sounds like it's a good progression just for you personally. Like, it feels like a healthy way to move. So
Well,
I'm hoping I can get to that. That's,
you know, it is it's a lot better not writing the whole thing and throwing it away again and again and again. But that said, I guess, you know, I had to write maybe 14 novels to get my first two, because the first 5 or 6 attempts at the first one, the first 5 or 6 attempts the second one were you know, terrible.
well, it's like an apprenticeship almost.
Yeah.
Like, you're learning through all those drafts, and the failure, you know, it's like fail better kind of thing, right?
Absolutely. And I think, you know, what I also tell writers about this particular thing, you know, young writers who are starting, is I've come to view that it is much less like climbing a mountain and saying, you know, there's you know, Mount Everest, and I'm going to get to the top of it, and I know where I'm going. And it's much more like digging a well. In other words, writing is, you make a void in your day of a few hours, and in that void, you don't do anything else. It's just a hole where you sit there and you try to write. And maybe you won't succeed in writing anything very useful, but you do try to write, you know, pretty much every day. And if you do that, the funny thing is, over a few years, you know, stuff comes. In the same way that if you make a hole in the ground and it fills with water, that's what a well is. So now I'm much more wedded to the idea of, you know, I guess, you know, if you think of it, it's less a question of, you know, do you get to heaven, and more a question of, did you pray today? So
Practice.
yeah, so it's you know, it's I guess in my early novels, I thought I have to write a book that does this, and then I would sort of often write that thing, and I'd be totally lost. I'd write this thing, and I would have, I guess, done what I thought I was wanting to do, and discovered it doesn't go anywhere. And now I suppose, a little bit more patient, in the sense of I'm not always sure exactly what the draft I'm writing is until I really figure it out. But I understand that that's okay. That I don't have to have something that looks like the draft of a novel. If I'm sitting there trying, it'll you know, it'll become water eventually. So I kind of wait for it, I suppose, much more now than I used to.
And do you see the all of your novels as being sort of in conversation. I mean, they're obviously all written with your preoccupations and obsessions, and but I'm interested in the relationship between the different books.
Yeah, I mean, my first novel, I guess my first three novels, we've talked about the idea that, you know, readers co-create novels, and that really a novel is a kind of invitation to play make-believe together between writer and reader. And my first three novels all, in a sense, directly address the reader. They were about, you know, the reader in Maud Smoke is this sort of judge that all the other characters tell their story to. And it's a small role, but it's not just a reader. And in Reluctant Fundamentalist, Chingez meets this American who's addressed as you. And that you, of course, also is a bit of a stand-in for the audience. And so it's hard to slip into a fully passive position when this guy keeps saying you to you over and over again in the book. It's more like a dramatic monologue on a one-man, you know, a one-woman stage play. And then in How to Get Filtration Rising Asia, it was very much an idea of you, the reader, and eventually an I, who's the author, and the characters called you, and the whole thing. But in my most recent, so those three novels, I guess, were for me about exploring this notion of what is the reader-writer relationship, and what is the fertility of that, and what can that do. And then the more recent two haven't, in a sense, directly addressed the reader as you. They've just tried to build stories that do the same thing, maybe in a simpler or less off-putting way. That I started to wonder if my approach was, you know, too dependent on readers having the same kind of education or cultural outlook or attitude towards literary fiction that I have, that I'm building these novels for readers who are like me. And you know, is that actually kind of weirdly elitist thing to be doing? And so I thought, you know, let me in Exit West sort of build the decoder ring of the novel into the book. And so I'll remove a lot of specificity and remove names and remove sort of place names and do all sorts of things, make it small and leave gaps and allow the reader to fill those things in without drawing attention to the reader-writer relationship. And the same thing, The Last White Man, in a way, it's, I suppose, a follow-on to Exit West, in the sense that it uses a lack of specificity and gaps and space to allow the reader to play this role instead of sort of directly addressing.
Right.
So I mean, I think that there's been a kind of similar project throughout the books, but you know, as I've grown up as a writer, I feel like there are ways to create that fertile space for readers that don't involve advertising themselves quite so much, and just sort of can organically happen.
I think we're almost out of time, but one person was asking what your next project is. So if you can talk about it.
But I'm not really sure. I mean, one thing that I've been grappling with, I've been trying to write it, the last two novels, is about technology and how we relate to technology and what it's doing to us. I tried to write that for Exit West, and then I found that the part of technology that interested me was the way the technology collapses distance. And so I wound up writing a novel where distance collapses and the whole world migrates in the space of a couple of years. And that was Exit West. But it wasn't a novel about our relationship with technology exactly. And then I wanted to do that novel this time, and I started to focus on the way in which technology has this kind of sorting mechanism, and how we're increasingly sorting ourselves into categories of being like me or not like me. And I wrote a novel where that sorting mechanism breaks down, where you can't really sort people, at least in a racial sense, into like me or not like me. You've got to figure out something else, some other way of thinking about these people. So hopefully next time I actually will figure out a way to write this novel about technology that is actually about technology, or I will discover that the way I write novels about technology is to write novels about other stuff.
Right.
Yeah. And I'll give up on the direct approach, and I'll realize that I'm kind of I approach, I guess, you know, tangentially to this thing.
Right.
That's the intention.
And the subconscious will lead you somewhere else, right?
Yeah, I mean, you know, one of the things that, as you know, about writing is that, you know, you discover so much about yourself and about, you know, what you're writing about in the process of writing. So I don't write novels in a way to tell people what I already know. I write novels to think about stuff that confuses me, and also to invite readers into an experience which maybe confuses them, but hopefully lets them then think about what's happened. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for
Thank
all
you.
of this generous conversation that you've given us.
Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful. So incredible, so thought-provoking. I especially love the idea of the reader being a co-creator of the novel and thinking about stuff that you are confused about. That's fantastic. That is just fantastic. So thank you very much. Congratulations on the book. Thank you to Miami Book Fair, to all of our bookstore partners for joining us. Beautiful cover, by the way. This is the art, not the finished book, but here it is. Absolutely gorgeous. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Good night,
Thank
everyone.
you. Great.
Good night.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.